Perfect. I'm also going to record. Okay, and then, all right, then mute. Okay, perfect. All right, hi everyone. My name is Rochelle and I'm the dietitian for Choices at Kitsilano. It's a pleasure to introduce Desiree Nielsen. Desiree Nielsen is a registered dietitian, host of the All Sorts podcast, and author of the best-selling plant-based cookbooks, Eat More Plants and Good for Your Gut. Desiree owns a private practice in Vancouver with a focus on chronic digestive and inflammatory disease, as well as plant-based approaches to optimal health. Desiree has worked as an educator in the natural health industry for over a decade for companies such as BioK, Probiotics, as well as maintaining an evidence-based website with plant-based recipes and education on plant-based gut-friendly nutrition. For those who are attending this presentation, I'd like to let you all know that you are eligible for a nutrition buck. So a nutrition buck is $10 off. It's a Choices coupon when you spend $50 or more. So a survey link will be sent out to you at the end of the seminar so we can collect your mailing address, and all nutrition bucks will be sent out approximately 1 month after the event. So you can visit or call your local Choices store to talk nutrition with one of our in-store nutrition consultants or myself, or email nutrition@choicesmarkets.com. And in terms of questions, please enter all of your questions in the chat box. Please remember that you do need to sign into your YouTube account or create one if you don't have one in order to participate in the chat box. But with that being said, I will pass it over to Desiree Nielsen and enjoy the.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be talking to you about leaky gut. I feel like it is one of the nerdiest, but also most fascinating topics in gut health right now. And I really know that in the holistic and integrative space, there's a lot of conversation around leaky gut. So we are going to talk about all of it here this evening. We are going to talk about what the heck leaky gut actually is. I feel like it's really important to have a solid basis for like leaky gut. That sounds like a made up internet thing. Like, what does it mean for the gut to leak? We're going to talk about it. Then really importantly, what causes it? Like, what does the science tell us about like what makes the gut barrier falter? We're going to talk about how the gut microbiome is involved, because of course it's involved in everything. And then we're going to take a look at nutrition and supplementation with respect to leaky gut. And I am here on behalf of BioK Plus. So I'm going to introduce you to one of BioK's products at the end. So first things first, does the gut actually leak? What does that even mean? What is the gut barrier? So one of the things that I think we need to sort of start to just set the foundation for this topic is the fact that your gut is not inside your body. Like, we think of it as being inside our body because it is, of course, surrounded by our body. But in reality, from entrance on through exit, it's actually continuous with the outside world. So that means to your body, to your cells, everything happening inside the gut space is actually outside of its body, which means that that gut cell wall is actually a really important barrier between you and the outside world, like just like your skin is. However, unlike your much, much thicker skin, there isn't as much going on the gut barrier. And we usually talk about the gut barrier being a single cell thick. And while that is true, there are actually many ways in which your gut is a barrier between you and the outside world. It's not like you have this little tissue paper lining and that's all your body can do to help keep the stuff that it wants out. In fact, there are multiple sort of layers of this barrier function. The first is the chemical barrier. I mean, think about your stomachs. Our stomachs are heavily acidic. And yes, that's really important for digesting and assimilating all of the wonderful food that we get to eat. But acids also kill microbes. And that is part of the inherent nature of an acidic stomach, that it helps to kill off any microbes that might have hitched a ride on your fork. We also have the biological barrier, which we're going to talk to later in the presentation. So the microbiota, the immune cells, the antimicrobial peptides. But when we talk about leaky gut, we're talking about the physical barrier. This is that, yes, single cell thick layer of epithelial cells, which you can see if that's your gut in this little illustration. You've got your gut there, and then you see these like finger-like projections. Your gut looks like a vast velvety carpet because it is so deeply folded to increase surface area for absorbing and assimilating all of the nutrients that you consume. But that vast velvety carpet really is made of one epithelial cell in terms of thickness, which is kind of incredible. So you have this physical barrier, and it's really important that that physical barrier be knit together. And we're going to talk about what happens when it's not, AKA when the gut leaks. But because there isn't a lot going on in a single cell, you might have noticed in this picture on the right here, it seems like there's like a little bit of a yellow layer on top of the cells. That is mucus. And it's really important to maybe take a pause here for anyone who is like learned about colonics or colon hydrotherapy, and they talk about, oh, how all of this mucus comes out when you do a colonic. The mucus in your gut is there for a reason. It is there to reinforce and defend your gut barrier, which is reason number 724 why I do not recommend colonics ever, ever, ever for gut health, because it can really disrupt the fragile nature of the balance of everything, the gut barrier, the gut microbiome. They might make you feel better in the moment, but they're actually putting you at risk for long-term dysbiosis and challenges later on. There we go. So what happens when the gut leaks? It is actually like a real thing. It sounds like a made-up internet thing. What you'll see in the literature, in the scientific literature, it's not often called leaky gut. It's called gut barrier dysfunction or increased gut permeability. So the ability of things on the inside of the gut space to permeate through the gut barrier and enter into the circulation. And so what actually happens when the gut leaks? Because it's not like it's just like dripping stuff all over the place. What we tend to see is on the left-hand side here, you have a nice, thick, healthy mucus layer on top of the endothelial cell or the gut barrier cell. You see that they have these little connections, those green and blue proteins. Those are the tight junctions. You can think of the tight junctions as the zipper on your jacket. It zips up to keep the gut cells nice and tight. And then when it comes to the gut barrier being impaired, or we have, so-called leaky gut, things start to look a little different. The mucus barrier can be diminished so that all of the bacteria that are meant to be in your, those bacteria are happy and they're where they're supposed to be and doing what they're supposed to do. The gut microbiome is amazing. It's not supposed to be able to access those gut cells. But when that mucus barrier is diminished, it can. And what we see happening is that those little zippers, those tight junctions aren't zipped up quite as tight. There are more substances being passing through in between the gut cells, which is not what we want. And then we also see that the gut cells themselves, your gut barrier is rapidly renewing. This is the other bone I have to pick with colonics, is that they say, oh, well, you can have, like old food or old cells stuck in. No, you can't. You literally cannot, because your gut barrier is rapidly renewing. You have a completely new gut lining every 3 to 6 days. Your skin, in contrast, it takes like 3 weeks. The renewal cycle on your skin is like 3 weeks long. It's like a total slacker compared to your gut barrier. Your gut barrier is constantly renewing, refreshing, pushing what is old out. It does this all its own. You might also see this word here called endotoxemia, which sounds like a big, scary word. And it's not a really good thing, but it's not as scary as you might think. What endotoxemia speaks to is that when the bacteria are in the gut space, they're doing their thing. That's where they're supposed to be. But if they can get through the gut cells, if they are exposed to the immune system just below the surface of that gut barrier, then the immune system recognizes quite rightly, hey, there's like germ stuff here. There isn't supposed to be germ stuff here. There are bacterial fragments that your immune system recognizes as potentially harmful and not being where it needs to be. And then the immune response ensues. And so this is probably another great part to, great time to talk about, like, how is the immune system involved in all of this? So we know that the vast majority of our immune system and our immune function is associated within and along the gut barrier. Because we have this very fragile gut barrier, because of its utter importance in being able to selectively uptake all of the nutrients we need to survive, but also keep out, the trillions of microbes that call the inside of your gut home. It's a really huge job for what is really not a super hefty barrier. And so in its infinite wisdom, your body places the vast majority of its immune cells, its immune tissues, its immune activity within and along your gut. So as soon as something breaches that gut barrier, the immune system is there. The immune system is ready to act. How does it act? Well, it acts with its first line of defense, which is inflammation. Okay, so let's talk about intestinal permeability. So what happens when the gut doesn't do so well? And what does this actually look like? And what can cause this? So the permeability of your gut is impacted by so many different things. And this is one of the other challenges about gut health in general, is it's never just one thing. I get so many questions from people saying, what one food or what one supplement do I eat or not eat, or do I take or not take to make this all better? When in reality, treating gut health is the ultimate sort of like holistic discipline, because you really have to look at the sum total of how you're eating. We're looking at stress. We're looking at all of these other factors that affect the integrity of the gut barrier, but also your gut health in general. So we know that one of the biggest things that you can do, not just one thing, but one important thing that you can do to help support gut barrier function and gut health in general, is eat plenty of plants. And the reason for this, and we'll talk more about this in a second, is that our gut microbiome, the microbes living in our digestive tract, they ferment the fibers. We don't absorb the fibers. Like, we don't digest and absorb fibers by definition. They are not for us. They are for our gut. They are for our gut bacteria. And when they ferment those fibers, they make something called a short chain fatty acid, which is exactly how it sounds. It's like a tiny little fat. And that fat is not just energy, although it is important energy for the gut cell itself. That enterocyte in your gut barrier uses the vast majority of our butyrate production, and it's actually fuel for the gut cell, like not our overall metabolism, but for the gut cell itself. So making lots of butyrate means that your gut cells are nourished and they're turning over well. But butyrate also has another function. Butyrate is a molecule of communication. And so the bacteria in your gut can communicate with your immune system and also with your nervous system through short chain fatty acids. So feeding yourself lots of plant fibers means lots of healthy bacteria producing short chain fatty acids like butyrate and having a positive influence on the whole cycle. And this is really important to note, because something else that regulates intestinal permeability is interactions between the nervous system in the gut and the immune system in the gut. And so we know that if the body senses that something is awry, it can actually challenge the gut barrier itself. Namely, a classic example of this is celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease that is characterized by an inflammatory attack on our gut lining. And so it is the immune system and the inflammation from the immune system that is causing this damage to the gut lining. And then there are also dietary components that we know are better for our intestinal permeability and not so good for our intestinal permeability. And you might be surprised by which ones they are. So let's also talk about normal variation. One of the things that I talk about in my book, Good for Your Gut, is that we get into this really weird space of, on one hand, totally ignoring all this, like the symptoms and the signals our body is trying to give us to say, hey, something is not right here. Maybe you should look into this. On one hand, the person who has literally had diarrhea for 4 months and has done nothing about it. And then on the other side of the spectrum, because I live in the world, we have people who make it sound like you should, I don't know, never fart, for example, like that you should never have a loose bowel movement ever, that you should never be bloated, that anytime you are any one of those things, something is terrible, something is suboptimal, and then you need to, oh, I don't know, go on this like really restrictive diet protocol and consume $400 worth of supplements. And like, that's supposed to be the fix. So we sort of don't talk about what is physiologically normal. We know what's common. So like have our gut health not be so great is pretty common, but that's not what's normal for your human physiology. And in fact, it is totally normal for permeability to change. So for the gut to get a little bit leakier sometimes and a little less leaky other times. A really great example is after you eat. The body is incredibly intelligent. And if it senses, it's like, there are a lot of nutrients in the gut. And if I just unzip a little bit, some of those nutrients are going to get into the bloodstream a lot faster so our cells can utilize them. And then once that meal is over, once those nutrients have cleared the gut space, zip, 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 the increased permeability is not needed. We know that as like blood glucose rises, as the carbohydrates enter the system, that absolutely the gut will allow that glucose to enter the cells via a little bit of an enhanced permeability. And I want to stop you right there, because lest someone said, oh, wow, carbs cause leaky gut. No. This is like a normal physiological process. And I think it's really important to understand, because there's a massive anti-blood sugar rise offensive on the internet, folks like Glucose Goddess and such, saying that like any food that makes your blood glucose rise is not good for you, when again, what is physiologically normal is for us to eat, our blood glucose to rise, because that means our body is literally getting the energy it needs into its cells and then for it to decrease. So this is normal for us to eat, permeability to increase. Once we're done eating, it goes away. There are also some substances that may cause transient alterations in permeability, and these are transient and they self-resolve. And now I say may with respect to alcohol, because what the research seems to tell us at this point is that chronic alcohol use absolutely does impair gut barrier function. So for the person who is, a moderate or heavy drinker consistently, it's probably not so hot for your gut barrier function. However, in the instance, like in a single sit down instance, and there was one, I think 2019 trial in young, healthy volunteers that found like just after a single instance of like sitting down to a few drinks, actually, there was no change in permeability whatsoever. So I think the message here is that if you consume quite a bit of alcohol, on a regular basis, like you're consuming, between 5 and 10 drinks a week, and you also have something wrong with your gut, or if you ever have something wrong with your gut, alcohol is probably the first thing to go in terms of doing something really concrete so that you're not contributing to enhanced leaky gut situation. The other thing to note is that pregnancy, there is also increased permeability noted in pregnancy. This is considered like a normal variation in gut barrier function over the course of pregnancy, and it should resolve. All right, so let's talk about causes and consequences. The first thing you need to know, leaky gut is not a diagnosis. I will say this again. Leaky gut is not a diagnosis, because I have seen and spoken with so many people who are like, oh, I went to this practitioner and they diagnosed me with leaky gut. And I was like, well, what's that mean? They're like, well, leaky gut is causing X, Y, and Z. Leaky gut is a physiological phenomenon. It's an underlying factor. It is potentially a symptom, but there's a lot that we don't know about why leaky gut occurs and what it all means. It's like, what does it mean? Is it the chicken? Is it the egg? And, one of the sort of like grandfathers of, gut barrier function research and leaky gut research is Dr. Alessio Fasano, who, made the molecule, and we'll talk about zonulin in a second, but made huge advances in understanding this molecule zonulin that can unzip that zipper of the gut cells in celiac disease specifically. And so Dr. Alessio Fasano thinks that gut barrier dysfunction or increased gut permeability could be one of those underlying factors that, while not the cause of other diseases, is certainly an exacerbating factor. But there's a lot that we still don't know in the research yet. And so it's really important if someone's like, oh, well, you've got leaky gut. First, we'd be like, well, how do you know that? And second, well, it's not a diagnosis. If there is gut barrier dysfunction, there is a root cause behind it. Leaky gut isn't the root cause. There is something else causing the gut barrier dysfunction to occur. Well, what is that? So we have some things that we know really, really well in the scientific literature, things like age, also increased body weight tends to be associated with increased gut barrier dysfunction. But there we want to say associated, not necessarily a cause. We know very clearly, gastrointestinal conditions like inflammatory bowel diseases, celiac disease, and yes, actually even IBS, particularly post-infectious IBS, that there may be enhanced leaky gut associated with these conditions. Anytime you have some sort of like gut infection, or if you have dysbiosis, which means not enough of the good bacteria and too many of the not so good bacteria, we also know that medications can be a cause. And so for people with chronic pain who are on a lot of NSAID pain relievers, those can significantly damage gut barrier function. We also know that stress can be a cause, and don't worry, we'll absolutely get to that. And then stress. And I wanted to note here, including extreme endurance exercise, because we're in Vancouver, we have a lot of athletes here. And so if you are constantly pushing yourself, if you are running ultra marathons, or you're just running tons of marathons a year, that kind of stress on the body can actually enhance. And we know particularly for runners that there can be some unpleasant gastrointestinal side effects to running as well. So we do know that gut barrier function can be an issue. And then something that we don't know a lot about is this more in people assigned female at birth or people assigned male at birth. So it's not well documented. There's been some hints, but we're not really sure. So what about the microbiome in all of this? Because if we have this very delicate gut barrier, if we have this enormous amount of immune function, and remember, our immune system is designed to protect us from germs. But then we have trillions of bacteria living in our gastrointestinal tract. A, how does that even work? And B, what is that actually doing for the gut barrier itself? The first thing you have to know is, how does this work? Is that the bacteria are not just passive riders. So because they have found a home in our body, they are actively protecting their place in our sort of biological community, or our biome, if you will. They are communicating via those short chain fatty acids, and they're doing a whole bunch of other things, like even just the idea of bacteria living and nestling into that mucus layer. As you can see, the mucus layer isn't static, it changes. So the top of the mucus layer, as you can see in this diagram, where it's more see-through, the top of the mucus layer is lighter, thinner, and there are going to be some bacteria just hanging out in there, they live there, that's their home. And then as it gets closer to the gut cell, you can see it looks a little denser. That's where no bacteria should be. That's how that mucus is keeping those bacteria away. But just by nestling into the gut barrier, good bacteria block potentially harmful bacteria from getting too close to the gut barrier, and which is exactly what's happening on the right side of this diagram. If the mucus barrier isn't looking good, then these microbes are like, hey, this is our opportunity to party. Let's get into these cells, let's make it happen. And indeed, certain strains are associated with improving barrier function, they make your gut barrier stronger, while others are associated with degrading the gut barrier. And we also know that having those butyrate producers is so important, because when we consume fiber and when we make that butyrate, the colonocytes, or those epithelial cells lining the gastrointestinal tract, are stronger, healthier, and they turn over more. They also help to, the bacteria themselves also help to like fight off those bad bacteria. So it's not just about sort of like out competing, taking up space, taking up food so that the other guys can't survive. They're actively fighting off. They create all of these molecules like hydrogen peroxide and defensins that are actively killing off the negative microbes so that they don't have an opportunity to thrive and multiply. And we know that having more of those negative bacteria, harmful bacteria, which tend to be of a gram negative. You can either have gram positive or gram negative, depending on how they stain in the laboratory. But these lipopolysaccharides, we talked about endotoxemia before. Those endotoxins are these lipopolysaccharides, which are exactly as they sound. So lipo means fat and polysaccharide is a carbohydrate. So they're like a fatty carbohydrate on the outside of the bacterial cell. And when those get into our system, that's when our immune system is like, hey, something is wrong. We've got to go to work here. So let's talk a little bit more about endotoxemia, because we know that the short chain fatty acids that are going to help enhance gut barrier function, in addition to indoles, which come from tryptophan, which is an amino acid that's found in like pretty much all of our food. We want our gut microbiome to do the thing that they were born to do, which is stay in the gut space, keep us well, keep the bad bugs away. But that increased permeability is going to lead to that translocation. So those bacteria going from where they're really supposed to be to where they're not supposed to be. And that's when the inflammation sort of kicks in. And with that, we get into sort of a negative cycle where if there's inflammation, there can be damage to the cells. When there's damage to the cells, more of those harmful bacteria can multiply, and it just sort of like picks up until something helps to calm the system down. And what is it like, if leaky gut is not a diagnosis, like, should we even care about leaky gut? Like, why do we care? Like, tell me what it's going to do for me, or like what it's going to do to me. We know that gut barrier dysfunction or leaky gut is actually associated with most chronic conditions, everything from things you do not expect, like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, to the ones you do expect, like the inflammatory bowel diseases and celiac disease. They're also associated, and this is very much a hot topic, but with autoimmunity like fibromyalgia and multiple sclerosis, neurological conditions such as autism or depression. Like, this is a laundry list of all of the chronic conditions we're dealing with as a society right now. And so, it makes sense that practitioners are really curious about gut barrier dysfunction and leaky gut, because it is associated with all of these conditions that are often hard to treat. So let's talk a little bit about autoimmunity, because something I see online all the time is leaky gut causes autoimmunity. And so leaky gut causes autoimmunity. So stop eating gluten immediately, and like X, Y, and Z other things. So let's talk about that. Because while integrative practitioners will often suggest that leaky gut is a root cause of autoimmunity, there is some physiological basis for that assumption. A great example is with celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease. You can have the genes for celiac disease, which we call HLA genes. They predispose you to autoimmunity like Hashimotos or celiac disease, but also they interact with gut barrier function. So that's an interesting connection right there. And studies have also suggested that there is increased intestinal permeability in autoimmune conditions like Hashimoto's, like multiple sclerosis, like type 1 diabetes. But is it cause or is it consequence? Is leaky gut really the cause of autoimmunity, or is the autoimmune process actually causing gut barrier dysfunction? And this is something that I don't think is considered well enough. Most folks will say leaky gut causes autoimmunity. The evidence suggests that maybe it is actually the autoimmunity causing the gut barrier dysfunction. And some of the reasons why we think this are that pro-inflammatory cytokines, so cytokines are little chemical messengers of inflammation. You need them, you have to have them. They help your immune system do its work, but they can increase permeability. So if you have autoimmunity, if you have inflammation and those cytokines are present, it could be the cytokines initiating the leaky gut, not the leaky gut doing all of the other things. We also know, because I mentioned how the bacteria in our gut are not passive riders, like they're actively communicating with the nervous system, with the immune system, with the digestive system itself. And we see in the literature that this crosstalk, this communication between bacteria and us can also trigger autoimmunity. And a great example of this in the literature is a bacterium called P. gingivalis, which, if your thinking sounds like gingivitis, AKA your mouth, you are absolutely right. There is an association between high levels of that gingivitis bacteria and autoimmunity. So let's look at this specifically in Hashimoto's. So this is a really small trial. We cannot say that this one trial tells all because it's much, much too small for that. N means how many subjects. There were 40 folks with Hashimoto's and 53 controls. And what they found was that there was increased intestinal permeability in those with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And there were also alterations to the gut microbiota. So they had different gut bugs. They had more of the genus Bacteroides and less of the bifido. And everyone knows bifido. We all love our bifido. It's a good thing. They had less of it. But there were no differences in those inflammatory cytokines. This seems pretty intriguing. You're like, okay, so we had a high zonulin, which we think means more leaky gut in people with Hashimoto's. However, there is some challenge to the notion, and this is really important for anyone sort of doing like integrative testing, because I know that serum zonulin, that molecule that we know zips and unzips our gut barrier cells, that a high zonulin means you have leaky gut. So if you're like, how did I get diagnosed with leaky gut? Oh, my naturopath said, oh, your zonulin is super high. You have leaky gut. There we need to take a pause. This presentation is actually like a consumer version of a very, very deep dive I did for dietitians earlier in the year, where I actually did a huge dive into diagnosis and testing for gut barrier dysfunction. And there is actually a decent amount of research suggesting that actually zonulin is maybe not a good marker of leaky gut. What zonulin might be telling us is that there's a lot of inflammation happening, because zonulin isn't just made in the gut. Your liver makes zonulin. Also, your adipose or your fat tissues make zonulin. So zonulin can come from a lot of places, and zonulin can be triggered by inflammatory states. And so there are some studies, pretty convincingly that zonulin being high doesn't mean you have leaky gut. It just means something's definitely going on if your zonulin is high, but it probably more suggestive of an inflammatory response as opposed to like true gut barrier dysfunction. So let's talk about nutrition. Let's say we've gone through it, you've done the testing, you did breath testing, not just serum zonulin, you know that leaky gut is present, and then you head on the internet and go, leaky gut diet. We need to talk about this. There is no leaky gut diet, despite what the internet says, because there are so many untruths told about how to address leaky gut with nutrition. And honestly, they're pulling a lot of that information out of thin air because it's not in the scientific literature. So let's get into what is. How does diet actually impact the gut barrier? We know that it can impact the gut barrier in multiple ways. So the first, by changing the gut microbes. So you decide what you serve for dinner. The gut microbes decide whether or not they want to come to dinner. So if you eat tons and tons of plants, you're going to have a community of gut microbes that is the kind that likes to eat all those fibers. If you have a really heavy dairy diet, you are going to have the kind of microbes that love that environment, and so on and so forth. So when we change our diet, we change our bacteria. And when we change our bacteria, we change how our bacteria interact with our human organism. Know also that the diet, when we eat those fibers, it can fuel the production of fermentation byproducts like those short chain fatty acids like butyrate. We also know that diet can alter the expression of those tight junction proteins. So those proteins that keep our gut cells zipped up, the way we eat can influence how many or where those tight junction proteins express themselves. And then the other thing that can happen is that I really love the idea of that food is not just nutrients, food is information. You know, your cells contain genetic material, contain DNA that is like an if this, then that roadmap to life. So they are powering your cells. If this happens, they power them this way. If that happens, they power them that way. And so there are things in our diet that can act as signaling molecules that change how this whole interaction and this whole community works. Get into specifics? Absolutely. So the first thing you have to know, that is a lot. If you're not familiar with the term PMID, that's a PubMed ID. So each one of those numbers corresponds to a clinical trial. So there's a lot of research on this slide. So you're like, oh, this is 100% evidence-based. And yes, it is 100% evidence-based, but most of this evidence is based on laboratory and animal data. So that's your first asterisk, because we are not a petri dish. We are not the same as a mouse. It's interesting to build up some theories based on that kind of research, but until we do this in humans, we can't be sure of any of this stuff. And we'll talk about what actually happens in humans in a second. So what do we know, like in general, what are the theories? The first is that a high-fat diet has been linked to changes in the bacteria and increase in those lipopolysaccharides from the bacterial cells. This is really critical because there is a huge, like just unwitting, it surprises me every day, but there's a huge movement on the internet to move people towards fiber-free, very animal-based diets for their gut health. This is the exact opposite of what the scientific literature says. And I understand why we get to this place and how, as a consumer, if you're like, oh, I try this and I feel better right now, you'll think that it's a good thing for you. And one of the challenges in over a decade of gut health practice is that so many of our most ill clients, the people with the most inflammation in their gut, the most irritation in their gut, they can't eat a salad. They would tell me, well, if I eat a salad, it comes out an hour later pretty much untouched. So you would already sort of get this sense that plants are irritating, plants are not for me. And if you eat a steak, for example, that has no fiber, that's not going to happen. You're like, okay, so I feel less irritated, so I must be intolerant to those plant foods, and this must be the diet for me. The challenge is that the foods that are least irritating in the moment are usually the foods that perpetuate the inflammatory states and the dysbiosis to keep you sicker longer. And when we have someone in our practice with a very, very inflamed gut, someone with Crohn's disease, for example, who moves their bowels 24 times a day, if you don't know anyone with that disease, you're like, how's that even possible? It's very possible, unfortunately, for someone with Crohn's disease. We will work with their individual tolerance and also some tricks that we have. For example, you're probably not going to eat kale, but I could put a leaf of kale in a smoothie and blend it up so it's really easy to digest, and it probably won't irritate your gut. So we use those sort of tools to build you up very slowly and build your tolerance, build your ability to enjoy these foods without irritation, to focus on long-term health as opposed to this whole carnivore thing that is happening, which is utter malarkey, utter malarkey. All right. So speaking further to that, we have sort of like the classic North American diet. I mean, all of us know that as a whole, as a society, the way that we eat in this country and in the US is not super great for our health. The lack of fiber, which is utterly critical to our gut health, but also our gut microbiome. And then also very high in very available sugars and easy to digest sugars. So this is the refined everything. I mean, absolutely. If you're having a Saturday night, this is not a Saturday night ice cream. This is like eating this way 5 times a day, 7 days a week, year over year. One of the things I'm really fond of saying is pattern over plate, because in wellness, we can get very caught up in this idea of good or bad, or these absolutes of toxic or clean, or all of this kind of stuff. And it just doesn't jive with the science. We know it's not about what you eat occasionally. It's about what you eat consistently. So you can have a Saturday night ice cream and eat all the plants the rest of the week. That's what's going to determine your bodily functions, your cellular functions, your overall health, not that single ice cream. Okay. Really, really important when we're talking about this kind of stuff. We know prebiotics and probiotics. Probiotics are the beneficial bacteria. Prebiotics are the foods that feed those probiotics, like plant fibers. Polyphenols are actually a really interesting one. So polyphenols are a class of phytochemicals, naturally occurring plant chemicals that actually improve the gut microbiota, have almost like a prebiotic-like effect, and may also improve the gut barrier. We know that vitamins A and D are associated with the expression of those tight junctions. Zinc deficiency is associated with impaired barrier function. And then, like I said, alcohol may or may not. One of the things to note about the nutrients, so vitamins A, D, and also zinc, taking them if you are not deficient isn't shown to improve things. This is for the people who are not getting enough, and then repleting their stores improves things. So let's start talking about fat. I know most of you thought I was going to start talking with gluten, but it's actually fat. We have an enormous amount of scientific literature telling us how fat affects gut health in general, gut barrier specifically. Now, also because I'm plant-based, I'm in this plant-based space talking about fat, it's really important for me to note that there is no need to consume a low-fat diet. There is no need to fear oils. There's no need to fear nuts, avocados. We are talking about sort of extremes of fat intake. So we know that fats can do a whole bunch of things. They can alter how those tight junctions are expressed. They can disrupt barrier function. They can alter the gut microbiome. They can even enhance the absorption of those endotoxins. How do they do that? This is all in a high fat diet. So the idea of like the Western style high fat diet that's low fiber with lots of fat, or in these more extreme, like high fat diets that are been in wellness for far too long for my tastes, but they're there. So it's important to you to know that fat is a really interesting molecule because like lipids and water don't go super well together. So like our gut space is like a watery space, and fats are, well, they are fats. And so in order to get them from the gut space into your circulation, they need to be packaged in a certain way. And one of the ways that we package them is called a chylomicron. It's essentially a little ball of fats that like helps it shuttle into the body. The challenge with these chylomicrons is that they just sort of indiscriminately pick up fats. And if you remember what LPS stands for, lipopolysaccharide, that lipo part is fat. So if you eat a lot of fat, you're going to build a lot of chylomicrons. You are going to unwittingly carry a bunch of LPS into your circulation, which is going to increase the amount of inflammation in your body. So eat like a regular amount of fat, like the kind of standard that is like so old school and dietitian boring, like that whole like 20 to 30, maybe 35% fat. We are not talking like a big deal, any of that. We're talking like when fat gets to like 50% of your intake or higher. These things are potential risk. Now let's talk about fiber. Fiber is definitely like the least sexy, like nutrient or anti-nutrient technically, because you don't digest and absorb it out there. But with respect to gut health, if there was anything close to like a magic bullet or a magic pill, it would be fiber. Fiber can improve the gut microbiota. It will build you better bugs. They will deliver you short chain fatty acids. It will improve your gut cells, those enterocytes. It will improve your immune function. And there are bacteria that when you starve them of fiber, the ones that actually build up that mucus barrier of your gut, if you starve them of fiber, they will start eating your mucus barrier. So it behooves you to eat more fiber. We also know that the kind of bacteria that goes along with eating more carbohydrates and more fiber is associated with better gut health outcomes. And that increased fiber intake as a whole is associated with improved barrier function, not consuming prebiotics. And so this is a real sort of like win for a whole diet approach to plant foods in their like most whole state whenever possible, as opposed to taking a supplemental prebiotic. So I want to talk a little bit more about butyrate, because I think it's probably, we talk about prebiotics, the food for the bacteria, the probiotics, the bacteria themselves, and then we have the postbiotics, the stuff that the bacteria make. Butyrate is a postbiotic. And I think the more science we get on butyrate and all of the potential things that it might do for us that are really good, I think we're going to start to see supplemental butyrate becoming more and more of a question and more marketed to us. And I would caution you against it, because butyrate supplementation is not currently supported. There are some bacteria that make it, others that don't. Like each bacteria has this thing that they make. You know, the bacteria that produce them are like F. prosnitzi. F. prosnitzi is, if you've got lots of that in your gut, like you are doing good things. It is associated with eating a lot of high fiber plant foods. But not all carbohydrates drive. So not all bacteria make butyrate. Not all carbohydrates that you consume drive butyrate production. And this is really important, because in the gut space, particularly around questions of gut diseases or gut barrier dysfunction, a lot of people, if you're not doing the like, oh, carnivore or like keto, like just avoid all the carbs thing, then we have sort of like the paleo style, avoid the beans, avoid the grains. That does you a massive disservice with respect to your gut barrier, because one of the core drivers of butyrate production is starch. Starch is going to come from those grains, from those beans, not so much from the fruits and vegetables. In addition, a molecule called arabinoxylan, which comes from whole grains. So yes, you heard it here, beyond a shadow of a doubt, whole grains, as long as you're not allergic to wheat or as long as you don't have celiac disease, whole grains are a really strong gut health food, because their arabinoxylans and because their starch drives butyrate production. And butyrate is the key to this whole wonderful mess. So what about gluten? I can't have a leaky gut conversation without at least giving it a little bit of lip service. We know without a doubt that if you have celiac disease, the autoimmune condition, and you consume gluten, gluten will drive zonulin production. That zonulin will help to unzip the cells somewhat. It will increase the inflammation that we find. We know that gluten and zonulin release go together in celiac disease. There's also been some practitioners talking about how gluten does this for everyone. And in fact, we saw, and this is why we talked about what is normal in terms of transient permeability, there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that gluten may transiently increase permeability with no pathology. That means with no bad outcomes. So just like how after you eat and that sugar, that naturally occurring sugar that you've broken down from, your apples and your whole grains increases permeability. And then once you're done absorbing, it stops. The same may be true for some, but not all people with gluten. And there is almost no human research to suggest that gluten causes any sort of pathology or any sort of negative health outcomes in patients who don't have celiac disease, except there may be some issue for folks with IBS-D, so diarrhea predominant IBS, who also have the celiac disease genes. So if that's you, worth talking to your healthcare team about, because maybe for you, if you've got IBS-D and you're like, I've done all the things, I've done low FODMAP, I'm working on my stress, I'm like taking the probiotics, I'm doing all the things and still nothing is better, might be worth talking to your healthcare team about whether or not you carry the celiac disease genes, because maybe gluten is a thing for you specifically. Also want to talk to food additives because there is a lot of conversation about, particularly in the plant-based world, because, plant-based milks, et cetera, have emulsifiers and stabilizers. And so there are some practitioners who are concerned about dietary emulsifiers, because what do emulsifiers do? They emulsify or they break up fats. What's your mucus barrier? Fats. So this seems like maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe if you consume a lot of dietary emulsifiers, maybe that would diminish the ability of the mucus barrier to keep those bacteria out, right? Like that thick part of the mucus barrier, maybe it's going to make it a little bit more loose, like the top of it, which is where bacteria can get into. However, this is all laboratory research and the human research is still lacking. So the other thing we have to go back to is what I said before about pattern over plate. As a gut health dietitian, if I see that 95% of your food choices are hyper-processed boxes and bags and you're trying to fix your gut, we're going to talk about getting more whole foods on board. If you are eating mostly whole foods, then again, pattern over plate. So a little bit of emulsifier in your oat milk is probably not a big deal when like 80% of your diet is whole plant foods. You're getting a tiny little bit of that and an enormous amount of things that help improve and thicken your gut barrier. You see, it's not these absolutes. It's not avoid at all costs. It's where do these fit into the larger pattern of how you are eating. If you're interested in carrageenan, because I know that that's been a big one, I have a very long, nerdy referenced blog post on my website about carrageenan and how carrageenan does not cause inflammation and how the science on carrageenan and gut barrier function and inflammation has actually been misinterpreted, because there's a ton of science, but it's been completely misinterpreted by, internet wellness. There is some, again, a little bit of research to suggest that artificial sweeteners, and actually even stevia in a recent article, that like maybe they're not great for your gut microbiome. But again, is that 90% of your diet? Yeah, let's talk. Is that like 5% or less of your diet? I'm really not worried about it whatsoever. I also want to talk about L-glutamine because ever since my choices days, which are a long ways away now, a lot of folks were recommending L-glutamine for leaky gut and for other gut health issues. L-glutamine is an amino acid, so a building block of protein. There is actually a very poor human evidence base. L-glutamine is used as a fuel source for those colonocytes or those epithelial cells. So yes, we have the butyrate, which is used as a fuel source by your gut cells. We also have glutamine, which is used as a fuel source by your gut cells. Neither one of them have evidence to support more humans taking them in order to prove gut barrier function. The only evidence that is intriguing about L-glutamine being beneficial is in post-infectious IBS. So if you went somewhere with really different gut bugs and you had a gnarly enteric infection and then you've had IBS ever since, you may be one of the only people for whom L-glutamine has an evidence base for. And this is really good news. One, because post-infectious IBS is hard to treat, so L-glutamine is great. But for the rest of us, L-glutamine is really, really expensive. And I find that it's so widely prescribed or recommended that you could be spending $100 a month on a supplement that's not actually doing anything for your gut barrier function. All right, so finally, let's talk probiotics, because I'm here with BioK Plus. So same thing, when it comes to leaky gut, we have a ton of research to suggest benefit of probiotics in like a whole bunch of categories, everything from antibiotic use to IBS, but specifically for gut barrier function or leaky gut, we have very little human evidence for use of probiotics in barrier function. However, we do have a bunch of theoretical reasons why probiotics might help. First is that we know that bacteria can alter mucin production and the function of your tight junctions. The function of your tight junctions, I should put that on a t-shirt. We also know that, hey, good bugs make butyrate. If you have probiotics supporting a healthy community of bugs, you might be making more butyrate. We know that probiotics help to create balance in the system, which is a good thing. And it competes with pathogens. So if you have pathogens that are, fighting off your good gut bugs and destroying your gut barrier, then a probiotic helping to kill off those bugs is in theory a very good thing. So I want to introduce you to BioK Plus. This is what the Pro line looks like. It is the exact same probiotic product as the one that Choices Markets carries. This is just the one that's specifically marketed for IBS, but it's the exact same strains. There are 3 patented strains in BioK Plus. They are all lactic acid producing bacteria, Acidophilus, acacei, and rhamnosus. And the reason why I wanted to show this is that BioK Plus bacteria are evidence-based to support symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. So if you are that person with post-infectious IBSD, you've got some leaky gut going on, but also there is a probiotic that is evidence-based to help support you in that. And there's a whole bunch of ways that it does that. So in the clinical trial, one of the things I love working with BioK Plus is that they're a very evidence-based company. They don't make any claims. They don't actually have human, not just lab studies, human clinical trials for. And so in the 12-week randomized control trial using the BioK Plus formula, it improved stool consistency, stool frequency, gas, bloating, and quality of life. And so if you have IBS, like I do, like many of our clients in our practice do, BioK Plus is an awesome choice to see if that can help bring you a little bit of relief. Great. And this is just the actual clinical trial itself showing quality of life improvement, feeling better about your BMs, less abdominal distension, better stool frequency, better stool consistency. All right, so it is Q&A time, made it into 1 hour. All right, I will stop sharing there. And if anyone has any questions, I would be so happy to take them. And I know I'm on a little bit of a delay here, so I will do the awkward pause while I wait for questions. If you have any questions about probiotics in general, if you have any questions about IBS or anything else with respect to gut health, you can let me know too. I am an open book.
As we wait for questions, maybe to roll on in, I will ask a question. So when it comes to, having probiotic-rich foods, would you recommend a certain amount of, say, kefir or different types of probiotic-rich plant-based kefir products? Or like the quantity, how much would you say?
Yes, I love this question, especially because I have a new answer to this question. If you had asked me this like 18 months ago, I had a very specific answer. So what's really surprising, because I also recommend as part of a gut healthy diet that people consume some sort of fermented foods, whether it's kombucha or kefir or like a coconut yogurt or miso, like all the good stuff. Eat some sort of fermented food every single day, simply because it's part of a healthy diet. Putting more bacteria in your system is always a good thing, even if those bacteria aren't actually probiotic. And that's one of the challenges with fermented foods, is that these fermented foods, yes, they have live microbes. Yes, interacting with non-harmful live microbes is always a good thing, but these microbes don't always have actual probiotic benefit. And we have very little human clinical evidence supporting the outcomes of fermented foods in gut health, which is really surprising. We have a surprise, like quite a lot looking at fermented foods, mostly yogurt. Yogurt really owns this sort of research line. But looking at yogurt, metabolic outcomes, so like blood glucose, blood pressure, blood cholesterol, but like for gut health, no, until recently, until last year. So there was this incredible study out of the Sonnenberg lab. Justin Sonnenberg is like this mega microbiome researcher, like so much cool research comes out of his lab. And they did this beautifully designed study. So they wanted to compare eating fermented foods with eating fiber. And so what they did is they took half the participants and they worked them up to a diet of 45 grams of fiber daily and kept them that way for 8 weeks, I believe. Then they took another group and they worked them up to 6.3 on average servings of fermented foods a day. What they found is that it was the fermented foods group that had improved microbiome diversity and decreases across the board in inflammatory markers. The fiber group didn't. And so it's pretty shocking. I mean, like all this, my whole ode to fiber over the last hour, you'd be like, the fiber didn't work, lady. Like, what are you talking about? It works. It just probably works a little bit differently. First, what the researchers admitted is that fiber probably, because you're not actually putting the bacteria in the system, because you're serving the dinner and waiting for word to get out about what you're serving, fiber probably takes longer to work than fermented foods. But then also the baseline fiber intake of the folks in the study, which often happens, people who like to participate in scientific studies are usually nerdier and more healthy than people who don't. They were already eating like 20 grams of fiber a day at the beginning of the study, which is way more than the average North American. And so the other thing they posited is like they were probably doing all right. Their baseline was already probably pretty activated on fiber, and taking them to 45 was like just too much, too soon. Like they had markers that showed that the ability of their microbiome to process that fiber had increased, but they probably just overwhelmed. Like your gut microbiome takes more time to adjust than that. So the take-home message from that is yes to fiber, but fermented foods, if you can get them up, like 6 servings of fermented foods a day is a lot. And so that's probably not for all of us. So I stick to my original, which is eat some sort of fermented foods every day. But if you're like, oh, I have IBS, I'm just going to drink kombucha. No. If you're like, oh, I want a healthy gut, I'm going to eat fermented foods along with my fiber. Yes. But for therapeutic benefit, we do need to reach for like those more intense probiotics.
Oh, that was such an excellent answer. Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that study. That was so interesting. And now we have a couple other questions also rolling in. So There's one that says, do you always recommend testing? Or actually, you know what, maybe I'll copy and paste it. This one's a little bit longer, just so you are able to read it back at it. Okay. Bring up the chat box. Okay. So here's the first question, and that is asked from, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, so I'll also just, let's see if you can.
So zonulin. Oh, hello. So yes, I would recommend, if you are going down the line of leaky gut, you have to have the breath testing. The breath testing, we don't really have a gold standard. Breath testing is messy enough on its own. Ideal would be a combination of breath testing and zonulin, absolutely. But yeah, so if you have access to that kind of testing, which not all of us do, I would highly recommend that you get both. And I will never, based on symptom pattern alone, say, hey, I suspect leaky gut. Just because suspecting leaky gut won't change my nutrition. And this is the other thing, sort of clinically, it's like, how will the information you are given change my advice, to help improve things? Leaky gut versus whatever else you have going on, whether it's IBS or just like severe bloating, or if you have some inflammation, I'm going to focus my nutrition on the inflammation, because all the things that you noted for like how diet interacts with leaky gut, that's all my nutritional advice anyways. We're not going to eat a 75% fat diet. We're not going to eat a low fiber diet. All the things that improve leaky gut are part of like standard gut health care. So yeah. How do you rate dairy yogurt for probiotics? Oh, this is a really great question. So it depends on the yogurt. One of the things that might surprise you is that yogurt bacteria are not probiotic. So the bacteria that make yogurt are really good at making yogurt. They die in the process, and they do not have defined probiotic benefits. So whenever your choice is looking at yogurts and you see a probiotic yogurt, what you'll notice is a little line that says what bacteria were added. In order to call a probiotic yogurt probiotic in Canada, they would have had to add defined Health Canada approved probiotic strains into the yogurt after the yogurt has been made. So in terms of probiotic, they typically add about 1 billion, again, like other brands can be different, about 1 billion CFU per 3/4 cup serving of yogurt. That's great in terms of for fermented food, in terms of like overall health. It's not a ton. So in terms of therapeutic benefit, like we then get into that conversation about the last study where it's like, if you want to do this just with food, it's like, okay, so you're consuming 2 cups of yogurt a day, and then like a half a cup of kimchi a day, and then like 2 cups of you're trying to get your fermented foods up high enough so that the bacteria get high enough to actually push a function.
I don't know if we have any other, oh wait, there's one follow-up question to the very first one. It said, along that same line, thoughts on other functional foods adding probiotics like bars, etc.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. Okay. I'm going to use my like inside voice for this. So because anything that becomes like trendy or well-known, you're going to see the marketing push on it. The types of bacteria added to most of those products are a spore-forming bacteria that is used because probiotics die. They are very, very delicate. And you put them in most things that they don't want to be in, and they're going to die almost immediately. So cereals, bars, protein powders, the probiotics that they're using is a very specific kind of probiotic that forms a spore, which it forms a hard protective shell to protect it. And like when it gets to a place where it feels confident, then it will, start to do its thing. The research on those bacteria show that they're really good at surviving like food processing applications. It doesn't show that they actually do much for you. So yes, you've got bacteria. I would treat those sort of probiotic added foods as more of a fermented food that we don't have a defined health benefit from it, but like, yeah, more bacteria, sure, that's a good thing.
I had another question. I know you mentioned that endurance exercise can impact our gut and maybe the symptoms we may experience. Do you have any recommendations for someone who may be participating in endurance exercise or any sort of high level activity that is experiencing all of these symptoms, and any way they can kind of moderate those symptoms?
Yeah. So we were talking about this offline earlier that, I am definitely the one area where I'm not really solid is sports nutrition. But from my sort of gut focused approach, if someone was experiencing those conditions, I would be focused on minimizing other stressors to gut barrier function. And so I would be looking like, are they on a lot of sports drinks, a lot of sports bars where we have a lot of emulsifiers? Like, what's their fat intake like? Like, what's their alcohol like? So I would simply be trying to eliminate other stressors and aggressors in terms of gut barrier function. And then absolutely making sure that we get a tolerated type and amount of fiber in. A lot of cereal fibers for someone who's like a heavy endurance athlete might not work with training all the time. So I would try and focus on more soluble fibers, which are going to be gentler, going to slow things down, particularly if there's loose stools, just more of that sort of gelling fiber action.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we can wait a couple more minutes to see if any other questions roll in. I personally really enjoyed your presentation. I'm even excited to even listen back to it again, just because I love watching things over and over again. And there's a lot of great content in here.
Yeah, it's a lot. I like to, I'm always, well, I'm a huge nerd out the get-go, like everybody knows that about me, but I really love giving people these very in-depth tools because I think the more we sort of understand like the basic structures and functions and physiology, then when we see some reel talking about like what leaky gut is, you'd be like, oh no, like that's not what it is at all. Like I actually know that. Like it's harder to get swayed by misinformation when you actually understand like the nuts and bolts of the physiology. And so I appreciate everyone hanging on for the nerdiness, but there's like a method to my madness.
So nothing else is rolled in, but I guess I'll leave you with one more kind of like question for everyone listening. Okay. If you could give maybe just one action step or one piece of advice for someone who maybe doesn't consume a lot of fiber or they're completely new to all of the discussion, what would you say?
Yeah, so if you're looking for one thing you could do right away, I would talk about my daily 3. So this is one of my favorite things. I practice positive additive nutrition. I'm far more interested in what you put in your body than what you don't eat. And so I encourage people to focus on like soft structures like the daily 3. So my daily 3 are omega-3 rich seeds, 2 to 3 tablespoons a day, legumes, 1/4 cup to 3/4 cup a day, depending on where you're starting out. And then green leafy vegetables. And the reason I choose these foods is that they're 3 foods that most of us aren't eating enough of. They're 3 foods that are incredibly nutrient dense and have enormous activity in pretty much everything that I just mentioned. So like, a great example is ground flax is high in soluble gelling fiber. Same with chia seeds. So you're going to get your omega-3s, but you're also going to get this gelling fiber. Legumes are like such a superfood when it comes to gut health. They have this like amazing amount of fiber, like more fiber than most other plant foods. You really do have to start slow. Most folks are like, well, I can't eat beans. I'm totally intolerant to them. And you have to think of your gut like a muscle. Like you wouldn't go from being totally inactive to trying to run a marathon tomorrow. And you wouldn't be like, oh, I'm intolerant to running. No, you just didn't train for it. You have to train your gut to handle that high fiber plant life the same way you train your legs for a marathon. So if you don't consume beans, if they typically give you gastro distress, you start with 1/4 cup. Consistency is key. Your body wants you, your gut particularly wants you to like eat the same things over and over and over. It gets more tolerant to them. So 1/4 cup of legumes, you can just like 1/4 cup of canned chickpeas. It's such a small amount, like whatever you're eating for lunch. Is it a soup? Is it a salad? Is it a grain bowl? Like just toss them on and slowly over time, even if it takes you like 6 months to get up to 3/4 a cup, consume those every day. And then deep green leafy veggies, everything from like arugula and gailan to kale to chard. They contain a ton of phytochemicals that help calm inflammation in the body and lots of vitamins and minerals.
Those are excellent. And then someone just asked for your website. Are you on Instagram, Facebook? Are you still doing a cooking show on TV? So I guess you can use that to close off.
Yeah, totally. So no, lovely people who watched The Urban Vegetarian. It was very much like a one season wonder back in the day. But you can find me at Desiree RD, like registered dietitian.com. I am on Instagram at Desiree Nielsen RD, but that will link to my website. It's easier to remember Desiree RD. And there's a link to my Instagram and my TikTok, which I'm only like 50-50 on at this point. Although I really like it. It's just like one more platform. And then, of course, the All Sorts podcast. So if you listen to podcasts, this is an evidence-informed wellness podcast where we are not afraid to get super nerdy and give you really positive, non-diet, weight-neutral wellness advice that actually works.
Perfect. Well, we definitely need more TikTokers like you on there. Well, thank you so much, Desiree. That was excellent. And yeah, everyone can contact her through her website or Instagram and find her on those. I know that I'm going to be listening to your podcast. Someone also said she sends out a great newsletter too. And perfect. Well, thank you again. And I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. I know I did. I'm going to share this link to watch back to all my friends and family. So perfect. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye.